last set of my positional rankings here for 2021 fantasy football. We're going to be covering my top 24 tight ends to draft in fantasy football this year according to the stats. This is the last set of positional rankings that we'll have. We're not going to be covering kickers or defenses this year. There's a lot of volatility involved there. You're also able to swap defenses or kickers week to week and really play close to optimal plays. So it's not really worth our time. It's not what we're focusing on drafting in our fantasy leagues. We're focusing on those big four positions, and we're going to round out our top 24 tight ends here with this video. So without further ado, let's hop into the top tier picks for this year. These tiers are going to be a little bit condensed. Typically, I can make an entire tier of stud picks, but with tight ends, it's a little bit more barren. There aren't as many stud picks out there. So starting off with the studs / breakouts tier, at number one, we have Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously a star-studded offense. Kelce is arguably the best weapon in that entire offense. Last year, if we take a look by the stats, he was hardly edged out by Tyreek Hill in almost every category. At the tight end position, there was nobody even close to as valuable as Kelce last year, as he averaged well over 20 fantasy points per game. So he was our number one tight end last year. Definitely going to be the guy I'm targeting in fantasy lineups for 2021 as well. At number two, we have Darren Waller of the Las Vegas Raiders, the number two fantasy tight end last year, and somebody with a ton of upside here in 2021 as well. Derek Carr is definitely going to be on the upswing this year. He has Henry Ruggs, Bryan Edwards, a few other weapons that they've added there in Las Vegas as well. So I expect them to have a very good year on the offensive side of the ball. A huge beneficiary of that is going to be Darren Waller. Obviously, tight ends are very effective in the red zone, and we obviously saw that with Waller as well. So averaged just over 17 points per game last year. Obviously, if we saw similar production this time around, you would be more than happy with that production. At number three, we have George Kittle of the 49ers. Obviously, he got hurt last season, was a little bit disappointing for those that drafted him, but in his limited sample size of a few games, he was still extremely productive with over 15 points per game. So a little bit concerning that he's coming off the drastic injury, but this guy is an absolute grinder, a very tough tight end, somebody you know who's going to go out there and give it his all on every play. I expect him to finish top 5 at least in fantasy scoring this year. I think he has a very high floor as well. That's why he finds himself as my number 3 tight end for 2021. At number 4, we have Mark Andrews of the Ravens. Not going to go into so much detail here. He didn't play every game last year, but when he played, he was extremely effective, averaging over 12.2 points per game. Obviously, Lamar Jackson, a very prolific passer, a top 5 fantasy QB for the year, so you can't go wrong there. At number 5, we have an interesting case, a rookie cracking the top 5. Kyle Pitts is no tight end, though. Somebody who's going to be taking plenty of snaps at wide receiver, going to be targeted much more like Jimmy Graham was when he was playing with the Saints. Now, Jimmy Graham obviously injured, getting a little bit older, not as explosive as he used to be, but Kyle Pitts could very much resemble some of the numbers we saw from Graham early on in his career. At number 6, we have Tyler Higbee. So I'm very bullish on Higbee this year. He's somebody I'm looking for a huge breakout season, somebody I'm drafting as a bit of a prospect play this year, and that has a lot to do with Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford is a huge upgrade over Jared Goff. I'm also giving huge boosts to Cooper Kupp, also giving them to Robert Woods, all of the other weapons on the Los Angeles offense as well. And Higbee gets a similar boost there. Not only is Higbee due for a huge increase in production, he's had plenty of ceiling performances over the last 2 years. So over the last 2 seasons, he's had 6 games of over 20 fantasy points, and that's not even in PPR formats. So somebody who goes out, scores plenty of touchdowns, has some of those big games, and somebody who's going to get a lot more solid and consistent production receiving passes from Stafford rather than Jared Goff. Our next tier for 7 through 12, these are going to be some of your fantasy starters, people you can plug in every single week, and some people I'm going to call my diamonds in the rough. People that aren't necessarily being drafted as starters this year, but people that could very well carve out roles for themselves in 2021. So at number 7, we have TJ Hawkinson of the Detroit Lions. I actually am a little bit less bullish on him than most. Most people have him in that top tier of tight ends, but a lot of it has to do with Jared Goff. I think it's a huge downgrade in production Obviously, Hawkinson is a third-year player now, has a lot more experience under his belt coming into this third season, but it is a downgrade in production from the quarterback position. I don't expect that team to play very well in general, so a lot of guys on the Lions this year for me are a little bit downgraded, so that's why we see Hawkinson at number 7. At number 8, we have Noah Fant, somebody who's actually going to get an opposite effect, somebody who has a huge upgrade at quarterback this year, assuming Teddy Bridgewater wins that QB battle. Noah Fant not only was very productive last year, he averaged 10 points per game. He was also very consistent. Played every single game last year, was not injured. So I'd love to see that, especially from a younger player. At number 9, we have Mike Gesicki, somebody I think that benefits greatly from Tua Tagovailoa's improvement. Obviously, last year he was dealing with the injury, didn't get a training camp, was kind of forced into the lineup in the middle of the year. So as a result, we didn't see great numbers from that offense. The fact is, though, when they played, Tua was extremely efficient. Didn't throw the ball very far downfield. Again, I think a lot of that had to do with the lack of training camp. Didn't have a lot of timing with his receivers. Didn't really know the playbook fully either. So now that he's had an entire training camp, Mike Gesicki also has even more weapons around him in that offense. They drafted Jalen Waddle. They're going to have Devontae Parker, who was a stud last year, improved O-line, very solid back in Myles Gaskin. I'm actually very bullish on the Miami Dolphins offense. And the fact that he came in as the number 7 fantasy tight end last year, I think he's very underrated. A lot of people aren't giving him the credit that he showed us last year. So averaging over 10 points per game last year, I look for him to score 12 to even 13 fantasy points per game here in 2021. And number 10, we have somebody who had a great year in 2020. Again, very under the radar. That's Logan Thomas of the Washington football team. I'm a little bit less bullish on him because I don't think Washington has the most explosive offense by any means. Logan Thomas was by far the best playmaker outside of Terry McLaurin, obviously. But here in 2021, I expect a little bit of regression from that Washington offense. So that's why he sees himself at number 10. At 11, we have Dallas Goedert, somebody who was a huge and one of the most consistent targets for Jalen Hurts in his starts last year. Somebody who all the signs out of camp point to a very big 2021 season. So as of right now, the beat reporter of the Eagles 2 days ago said that the number 1 pass catcher in camp so far has been Dallas Goedert. Number 2 has been Zach Ertz. So it's not just a talent level thing. Jalen Hurts obviously loves throwing the tight ends, loves going to some of those shorter routes. He doesn't have the most arm strength at this point. Also, there's a little bit more consistency with those short routes as well. Obviously, the receiver's timing has to be perfect on some of those outer routes, a little bit more, let's say, risky as well. So for a younger quarterback, I look for him to really rely on Dallas Goedert this year and for him to improve on his 20th ranking from 2021. And at number 12, we have Robert Tonyan Jr., also somebody I'm a little bit less bullish on this year than most. That's just because last year was a little bit volatile. He scored over 30 fantasy points in 3 games. He also scored less than 5 fantasy points in 7 games. So he was very much so boomer bust last year, which is very good for DFS or, for single game formats. But when we're drafting a guy for a season long league, we're trying to get a guy to be our fantasy starter. And Robert Tonyan Jr. is a top 5 ADP tight end this year. He's not really what you're looking for. And now the tight ends are starting to get a little bit hairy. These are guys that I think have potential for 2021. Some of my flyer picks, definitely people that don't have roles that are consistent or very carved out. At 13, we have Evan Ingram of the Giants, somebody who had a very mediocre year in 2020, was injured for a lot of the games. Daniel Jones didn't look good either. But Daniel Jones is somebody I look for a lot of positive regression here. I think he's obviously has more time to learn his system. He's somebody who's very accurate, depends on timing. And as he gets more and more in that timing in that offense with his weapons, with his receivers, I think he's going to be even more productive. He also gets Saquon Barkley back, another year under that head coach. So with Evan Ingram, I look for him to improve on his 2020 season. And again, for him to go from 15 to number 13 isn't that much of a jump. So I think it's perfectly reasonable. At 14, we have Hunter Henry of the Patriots, moving from the Chargers to the Patriots. I think it's a slight downgrade. Obviously, that Chargers offense was very high volume, went out there throwing 350 passing yards per week with Herbert, which is crazy for a rookie. But now that he heads to the Patriots, they're going to be much more of a running first offense. Cam Newton's expected to get the start. Cam Newton's actually somebody I think is going to have a great season for New England. But again, a lot of that's going to be with rushing stats. So Hunter Henry, not that I think he's going to have a bad season, but he came in the number 12th ranked fantasy tight end in 2020. I look for him to fall down to number 14 this year. At number 15, we have Rob Gronkowski. He just doesn't play play enough to really be an elite fantasy tight end. Obviously, on a per down basis, still one of the best tight ends in all of the NFL. Scores the most touchdowns per snap of anyone at the tight end position, even more than Travis Kelce. So you know he's effective. You know he's extremely efficient. Ended up being the number 8 fantasy tight end in 2020. Again, one of those sneaky productive players that really turned it on towards the end of the season. I think a lot of people are going to be drafting Gronk earlier than they should be. Again, there's a lot of name recognition there. A lot of guys just like Rob Gronkowski, so they tend to draft him. If he ends up falling to you, let's say in the 7th, 8th, maybe even 9th round of a fantasy draft, you really need a tight end. I don't think he's a horrible pick to go to, though. Irv Smith Jr., somebody's definitely a flyer pick, a little bit more speculative this year. But the Minnesota offense is high volume. I mean, we've seen it before. Kirk Cousins averaging well over 300 passing yards per game. Had a decent amount of touchdown production as well. So Irv Smith Jr., now that you have Kyle Rudolph out of the mix there in Minnesota, he's going to be getting a lot more snaps, a lot more looks in the red zone. Could look for him to take a big step forward here this year. Hayden Hurst of the Falcons, he was the number 10 fantasy tight end last year. I think that whole offense takes a massive step back here in 2021. Matt Ryan's still going to throw for 300 yards per game. He's not going to be very efficient, though. Obviously, losing Julio Jones, you have a lot of rookie receivers being mixed in there. Even at running back, it's not a very strong position anymore with Todd Gurley leaving. So I don't necessarily like the Falcons' offense in general, so that's why you see Hayden Hurst drop from number 10 to 17. And at number 18, we have another rookie. This is a little bit of a homer pick. I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, obviously. But Pat Freiermuth has looked like an absolute beast in camp. As of right now, he's the odds-on favorite to gain the starting job right off the bat for the Steelers, taking that away from Eric Ebron. Eric Ebron couldn't catch shit last year. Got targeted a ton in the red zone. Big Ben loves his tight ends. And Eric Ebron just didn't get the job done. Was a laughing stock of the Pittsburgh Steelers team last year. So Pat Freiermuth is going to see a ton of targets, and if he can even catch half of the passes that Eric Ebron should have last year, should put up some really nice numbers and essentially being completely overlooked in fantasy drafts. And finally, our last tier of tight ends. This is the stash and hope tier. We're going to call this the complete lottery ticket tier. People that don't have carved out values, people that might need injuries or might need extremely severe circumstances to come through for them to have good years. But I definitely think it's possible for all these guys. At number 19, we have Zach Ertz. If Dallas Goedert goes down, Zach Ertz is going to have a massive year. And obviously vice versa. If Zach Ertz goes down, then Dallas Goedert's going to be getting even more targets. So just like I said before, Jalen Hurts, a guy that loves to look for the tight ends. And while Zach Ertz had a very injury-plagued 2020 season, I look for him to rebound here this year. At number 20, we have Jimmy Graham. So of the Chicago Bears, a lot of this has to do with Justin Fields. So immediately out of camp, people were all over Justin Fields, calling him the next big thing, the next best prospect since Patrick Mahomes. Since then, a lot of that talk has died down. He's struggled in a few of his preseason appearances, hasn't looked that great in his practices either. But if he ends up being great, ends up going out there and really energizing that Chicago offense, obviously Jimmy Graham's going to be a huge beneficiary. Last year was the 13th ranked tight end in 2020, averaged 9 points per game, was very consistent, did not miss a game due to injury. So I like his consistency. I like the chances for him to have a better season this year just due to the upgrade at quarterback. But I'm a little bit hesitant seeing his results in the preseason so far. At 21, we have Austin Hooper of the Cleveland Browns. Austin Hooper's very efficient. I wish he was on a team with high volume. I wish it was on a team that went to their tight ends a lot. But up there in Cleveland, they are very much so a run-first offense, a team that targets their wide receivers a lot more than their tight ends. But if you have some of those options go down, maybe OBJ gets hurt again, maybe it's Jarvis Landry, perhaps the running backs on their team get injured and they have to go to a more of a passing offense, more of a passing attack, Austin Hooper would be a huge beneficiary in that type of scenario. At 22, we have Dalton Schultz. So tight end isn't a massive position for the Cowboys. Most of their production comes from Zeke, obviously that stud set of wide receivers. But last year when Dak Prescott was healthy, Schultz saw very solid production. So before the Dak Prescott injury, he was averaging 14.6 points per game. Ended the year as the number 11 fantasy tight end with just 9.2 fantasy points per game. Again, he had Andy Dalton thrown to him for most of the year. I don't hold that against him. He was still able to put up production even with a half-assed quarterback. And again, we saw what he looked like when he had Dak Prescott. He's supposed to be the number one tight end for the Cowboys this year. And as a result, I look for Dalton Schultz as a pick a little bit further down the board, maybe as a backup that could potentially pop this year. At number 23, we have Jared Cook, moving from the Saints to the Chargers, an absolute touchdown machine. Again, Justin Herbert, one of the highest potential, one of the highest volume quarterbacks in the NFL. So anytime you have a tight end that catches a lot of touchdowns and is a very explosive offense, you're going to love that. So Jared Cook, also somebody I don't mind taking down low. But at number 24, we have by far the ugliest pick on this entire list. That is Chris Herndon, the fourth of the New York Jets. This completely comes down to the Jets QB situation. Zach Wilson, we've hardly seen. Hasn't even looked very good in the preseason. But if he comes out, again, he's a top 5 fantasy quarterback. Top 5 draft pick this year. Comes out, ends up being a good fantasy quarterback. Chris Herndon is going to be a huge beneficiary there. He's somebody who's explosive, has down the field threat as well, but we haven't really seen that since he's had shitty quarterbacks his entire career. So somebody you don't even have to draft, you could probably pick up after the draft off waivers. So there's no real investment you have to make there. And I do think the potential's there for him to at least have a good season if Zach Wilson's halfway okay. That's all I've got for this year's tight end rankings, guys. Let me know in the comments who your favorite tight end to draft is this year. Maybe it's one of the studs. Maybe it's Travis Kelce the whole way up. Or maybe you're saving for maybe the 8th or 9th round in your fantasy drafts to take your sleeper pick. Let me know who that is. I'd love to hear it. And as always, guys, make sure to like and subscribe if you guys enjoyed the content. Not only does it help me with growing the channel, it also makes sure that you guys can catch my content as soon as it's posted to the channel. So a win-win right there. Really appreciate it again. Good luck with your fantasy drafts. I'm sure you may have already had your fantasy draft. You may have one coming up this weekend. Good luck. You guys can always just print out these rankings if you guys would like. I'm going to have them up on my website over the next weekend. You'll have a list on there, easy to print, everything like that. So you have all the tools there. Good luck. Again, comment. Let me know who your favorite tight end this year is. And I'll see you guys next time where we go over my top 100 fantasy football players, period, at any position, exactly where I draft them. And that'll be the last video for this year's ranking. See you.